It was 10 o'clock on the morning of the 7th of April 1853, and John Snow's eyes scanned across a note from Sir James Clark, physician to Her Majesty Queen Victoria. Just over 2 hours later, he found himself in the Queen's private rooms in Buckingham Palace. Victoria was in labour, about to deliver her 8th child. At 20 minutes past 12, he began to administer chloroform in measured doses on a handkerchief, giving just enough to ease the Queen's pain, but never so much as to induce unconsciousness. After 53 minutes of inhalation, Prince Leopold was born, and Queen Victoria thanked Dr. Snow for his services. His decision to use chloroform was controversial, inciting a debate about risk and benefit in anaesthesia, and as doctors wondered about those benefits and risks, they'd look to Queen Victoria's empire to try to prove once and for all where chloroform's risks truly lay. As doctors tried to prove once and for all whether chloroform had a direct effect on the heart, causing it to stop beating, they'd come up against some of the problems of clinical research that we still grapple with today. My name is Matthew Heron, and this is Ether Or. It's the story of the history of anaesthesia, the gases we once used to put people to sleep, and how the safety of patients became central to a modern specialty. Just like those first anaesthetists, today we're still exploring where the danger lies, and wondering how best to balance the benefits of anaesthesia and its risks to keep patients safe during surgery. Chloroform was dangerous. By now there was no doubt about that. People were dying up and down the country as a consequence of it. In London, they believed chloroform could suddenly stop the heart beating, something they called cardiac syncope, and they'd keep a finger on the pulse to detect it. But in Scotland, where chloroform anaesthesia was discovered, they believed people were dying because they were given too much chloroform, which would stop you breathing. The conflicting opinions had led to conflicting methods for chloroform administration, as Dr. David Wilkinson, anaesthetist and former Wood Library-Museum of Anaesthesiology Laureate, can tell us.
There were two sort of staunchly opposing views about the action of chloroform at that time. The first was that you had to watch the pulse, and if you watched the pulse very carefully and it changed at all, then you should stop giving the chloroform. And other people believed that people died because of respiratory problems, because they were given an overdose. So all you had to watch was the respiration. Now, the Scottish field believed that you just watched the respiration. That's all you needed to do. And if the respiration started to slow down, you stopped giving the chloroform. Whereas the London school all believed you should very carefully watch the pulse.
The polarisation of opinion was evident when the London surgeon Thomas Wakeley heard a shocking rumour about chloroform in 1853. In response, he published a letter in The Lancet, the medical journal of which he was a founding editor. A very extraordinary report has obtained general circulation, he wrote. Intense astonishment has been excited by the rumour that Her Majesty, during her last labour, was placed under the influence of chloroform, an agent which has unquestionably caused instantaneous death in a considerable number of cases. In Wakeley's view, the sole benefit of chloroform, pain relief for an apparently uncomplicated labour, was outweighed by the risk chloroform posed. Chloroform's unnecessary inhalation involves an amount of responsibility which words cannot adequately describe, he wrote. Divided on the risks, the biggest puzzle for 19th century doctors was why people were dying from chloroform. For us, looking back, it's why they didn't stop using it. Was it ignorance, or was it apathy, or was it something else? Wakeley's letter shows how divided doctors were, but it also shows the beginnings of a conversation about benefit and risk that we're still having today. The risks of surgery were accepted and unavoidable. For some doctors, the only danger lay in not paying attention to the breathing when you gave chloroform. But it made others stop and wonder, if you didn't need to give chloroform, should you? Was ether safer? And if it was, should they use that instead? They might have disagreed on the cause of the deaths, and their attitude to risk might have been different to ours today, but they wondered just as much as we do about how they could anaesthetise their patients safely.
And so it was very simple for the London school down there with Snow saying, blame those Scots because they're not watching the pulse. And the Scots were all saying, well, blame the London people because they're not watching the respiration. I mean, people were concerned, but they weren't as concerned as we would be nowadays with that sort of mortality. You could see at meetings that were held in London and presumably in Scotland as well, and all around the country, people were talking about it and sort of trying to find out other ways of doing things, like buying a new agent or having another mixture or something. But they weren't really that fussed about it until somebody got together, well, perhaps we ought to look into this a bit more closely. And that's what they did in that first commission in 1864.
When we look back at the chloroform deaths and ask why doctors didn't just stop using it, the best place to look for an answer is in what doctors told themselves about what the risk was, and what they did about it. The polarisation was part of the problem, and doctors with strong opinions became entrenched in their views. Clearly, if you believed that the risk of cardiac syncope didn't exist, you'd carry on using chloroform, safe in the knowledge that as long as you monitored the patient's breathing, you could keep them safe. John Snow and Joseph Clover had introduced inhalers to limit the concentration of chloroform you could give to a patient to try and make it safer, but not everyone used them, and the deaths had continued even when they did. The 1864 committee was an attempt to end the debate once and for all. It would be the first of many committees and commissions that debated the issue over and over.
The other thing that they did, which was partly advocated by that first investigation in 1864, was to start mixing combinations of chloroform and ether together. So instead of just giving chloroform or just giving ether, they would get a bottle and put one part of chloroform and 2 parts of ether in it, and then shake it up and then administer this mixture. Now that didn't form a new compound, but they believed it did, and that made it slightly safer because the effects of the 2 drugs were slightly synergistic. So every anaesthetist in the world started making their own combinations, and if you look through the literature, there are incredible things like, they used to call it C2E4 or something, which was 2 parts chloroform to 4 parts ether. And then it was sort of C2E15 and things. And how they spent time making up all these combinations must have been classic. And there was a chap called Harley who made a very effective mixture of alcohol, chloroform and ether, which they called ACE, which was alcohol, chloroform, ether. So Harley's ACE was the ACE drug at one stage.
The committee's results supported the hypothesis that chloroform did depress the action of the heart, and in its recommendation to combine ether and chloroform, we can see hints of anaesthesia that we would recognise today. Mixtures of ether and chloroform try to harness chloroform's benefits and ether's relative safety, whilst minimising ether's side effects and offsetting chloroform's risks. Today we use combinations of drugs, tailoring the ratios from patient to patient to induce anaesthesia and to avoid some of the potentially harmful side effects. The drugs might be different, but the principle is the same, and it shows that doctors were finding ways to try and manage the uncertainty. Of course, some doctors did stop using chloroform. When a second committee confirmed through experiments on rabbits that chloroform did have an effect on the heart, one surgeon wrote that he would regard himself criminally responsible if he placed any patient in danger of his life by the use of chloroform when ether was so efficacious and so very much safer. The report of that second committee, published in 1877, encapsulated the problem. Confirming that chloroform did have an action on the heart, it concluded that ether was superior to chloroform. It had, however, one disadvantage: the length of time which was required to obtain its action. The reality was that, were it not for its sometimes fatal outcome, chloroform was a better anaesthetic than ether. It worked faster, it smelt better, and it didn't make patients sick. So while the potential risk meant some doctors avoided chloroform altogether, others continued using it, safe in their belief that the risk of a cardiac death didn't exist. Somewhere in the middle, doctors were using chloroform inhalers, or mixtures of chloroform and ether, like Harley's ACE, to try and offset the risk. The chloroform committees of the 1860s and 70s didn't do much to change practice, but they give us a vivid glimpse into the beginnings of a discourse about risk in anaesthesia that continues today. We might not use chloroform in anaesthesia anymore, but we're still thinking about the risks that come hand in hand with what we do.
If you're having a procedure, particularly surgery, then often the surgery of itself has intrinsic risks and complications. So surgery of itself has risks. Anaesthesia, which is needed for surgery, either rendering a patient unconscious or rendering part of the body insensate, of course has its own risks as well. Any drug that causes unconsciousness always has other side effects, affects other organs. And so that in itself creates risk, and the role of the anaesthetist is to minimise that risk.
Over the last 175 years, our perceptions of risk have changed, as we've discovered and explored the scope of risk in anaesthesia, recognising it, quantifying it, and trying to minimise it. Dr. Tim Cook is a consultant in anaesthesia and intensive care medicine, and he can tell us how, even over the course of his career, the risks in anaesthesia have changed.
So we've got risk from the procedure, we've got risk from the anaesthesia required to enable that procedure, and the third level of risk is the added risk that the individual patient brings to the situation. So when I started medicine as a houseman in whenever it was 1987, so more than 30 years ago, many patients having surgery were fit and well, and it was simply the risk associated with the procedure and the anaesthesia. But now the norm is that patients are often older, they have comorbidities and pre-existing complications, which mean that the risks of undergoing surgery and anaesthesia are compounded by managing those risks.
Tim is involved in the investigation of risk in anaesthesia too, through the National Audit projects, in conjunction with the Royal College of Anaesthetists. The National Audit projects, or NAPs, began as a study to provide more information to patients about the specific risks of epidural and spinal anaesthesia, and they've developed into a highly anticipated, well-respected source of information on anaesthetic risk. The recommendations they make for improving safety in anaesthesia have international reach.
In the National Audit projects I've been involved with, they really start with NAP 3. We looked at complications of nerve blockade, epidurals and spinals. NAP 4, we looked at difficulties with managing the airway. So that's when patients are rendered unconscious. The anaesthetist takes over the physiology of the patient. And that in particular involves taking over their breathing and taking over the airway passages. So ensuring that there's a clear route from the outside world to the lungs. And complications of airway management are also prominent in major complications of anaesthesia. NAP 5, we looked at unintended awareness, and NAP 6, we looked at anaphylaxis or severe allergy.
The National Audit projects echo the work done investigating chloroform in the 19th century, exploring important safety issues in anaesthesia to ask where the risks lie, and making recommendations to improve patient safety. In the 19th century, doctors were investigating whether chloroform induced cardiac arrest. And now, in 2021, Tim and his colleagues are investigating modern causes of cardiac arrest associated with anaesthesia and surgery in the 7th National Audit project.
NAP 7, which has just started, we're looking at the sort of final common pathway of many of the perioperative complications, which is cardiac arrest. Essentially, what we're seeking to do is to explore, for whatever topic we choose, these rare events. We're choosing to identify all the events that occur throughout the UK in a period of a year and study those individual events to identify themes. For the purpose of this project, a perioperative cardiac arrest, so that is loss of cardiac output leading to either defibrillation or at least 5 chest compressions occurring within the perioperative period, which is from the time the anaesthetist first becomes physically involved in the care of a patient to 24 hours after the patient wakes up or reaches recovery. We're aiming to identify all those cases. We're expecting to identify several thousand of those cases from the 3 or 4 million anaesthetics that will take place in the UK in the next year. And in order to collect those cases, we have a network of local coordinators who individually, voluntarily, unpaid, coordinate the project in each locality, and we are hugely indebted to them for their work.
There are thousands of studies every year that explore issues in anaesthesia. The national audit projects are different, using a specific methodology to identify how frequently rare events occur, all to make recommendations to improve patient care. The data from NAP7 will allow an analysis of perioperative cardiac arrests in the UK to give us information on how many of those cardiac arrests occur in pregnancy, in paediatrics, in older patients, and in patients with other medical problems. At the end of the project, when common causes or contributing factors are identified, recommendations can be made to reduce the risks, not just in the UK, but all around the world. In the 19th century, doctors were immovably aligned with one side of the argument or the other. Today, anaesthetists all around the UK engage with the national audit projects, contributing to their international impact.
These are a form of sort of collective citizen science undertaken by Anaesthesia and Intensive Care UK, but we rely entirely on anaesthetists working in all hospitals on identifying cases and reporting cases and returning information from the numerous surveys that we send through. And that's a fairly arduous amount of work. These are very efficient projects in terms of their overall costs, but they rely absolutely on the engagement of all UK anaesthetists. And it would be completely wrong of me to talk about the project without expressing how important that is and emphasising the thanks that are due to all anaesthetists in the UK for their engagement in striving to improve the safety of what we do and improve patient care.
The national audit projects influenced the practice of anaesthetists all over the world, but after the committees in 1864 and 1875, chloroform use continued, and the deaths that came with it were by now a routine occurrence. The total number of anaesthetic deaths reported in the British Medical Journal between 1870 and 1880 was 138, 120 of which were due to chloroform. The committees hadn't done much to change opinion, and doctors continued to align themselves with one side of the debate or the other. And they might have been happy to carry on like that, but in 1889 news arrived from India that would reignite the argument.
It does seem strange, doesn't it? I mean, it's all part of the British Empire. Laureate went out to India, to Hyderabad, to work. And he thought that while he was there, this was a good opportunity to do some research. And so he published in the Lancet, out of nowhere, seemingly, a paper in 1889 of what he'd done investigating the effects of chloroform on about 300 dogs, what they call pariah dogs, wild dogs. And he found that there were no problem at all giving them chloroform, and there were no cardiac effects from doing that.
Surgeon Major Edward Laurie had been a medical student at Edinburgh University under the tutelage of James Syme, the pioneering Scottish surgeon who was fiercely pro-chloroform. Laurie had learned the Scottish method of chloroform administration, dropping it on a cloth and watching the breathing, but not feeling for a pulse. In 1871, he applied to the Indian Medical Service and worked his way through various positions in India before being appointed resident surgeon at Hyderabad in 1885, one of the most important medical appointments for a man of his rank. Soon after, he'd been appointed the principal of the medical school of Hyderabad and personal physician to the Nizam, the monarch of the state of Hyderabad. He'd seen the results of the earlier chloroform committees and obviously disagreed with them. His tutor in anaesthesia, James Syme, reportedly never had a fatal case, and neither had Laurie, who practiced Syme's technique. Determined once and for all to prove chloroform's safety, he organised a commission with the Nizam's backing, which undertook experiments on animals. Finding that chloroform had affected the breathing of the animals, but not their hearts, the results of his work, and the inflammatory conclusions Laurie drew from them, were published in the anti-chloroform medical journal, The Lancet.
They had made experiments with reference to the effects of chloroform which had conclusively decided a question which had been in dispute ever since chloroform was first introduced. They had killed with chloroform 128 full-grown pariah dogs averaging 20 pounds weight each. What they found was that no matter in what way it was given, in no case did the heart become dangerously affected by chloroform until after the breathing had stopped. He had no doubt deaths would go on occurring until the London schools, which of course influenced the whole world, either entirely changed their principles and ignored the heart in chloroform administration, or else confined themselves exclusively to the use of an anaesthetic like ether, which with all its disadvantages they know how to manage.
And the editor of The Lancet was incandescent about it. He could not believe that it was true, because he was convinced that chloroform had a cardiac effect, because that's what all his peers were telling him who were using a lot of chloroform. So he was convinced. And so he wrote a storming letter back saying this wasn't true. And so Laurie was very upset by that. He said, yes, it is true. And he obviously discussed it with the Nizam of Hyderabad, who offered £1,000 for anybody to come out to India and to repeat the experiments, and they'd show that Laurie was right. Now, £1,000 in 1889 was a huge sum of money, ginormous sum of money. So the editor of The Lancet said, yes, we'll do that. And they promptly appointed Lauder Bruton, the man to go out there. Now, Lauder Bruton was a pharmacologist, basically, and he believed categorically that chloroform affected the heart. There was no question. So they loaded the dice. The editor of The Lancet loaded the dice. And later on that year, they did the experiments so quickly, it seems there were reports of them anaesthetising rabbits and horses and dogs in huge numbers, hundreds of them. And by December of 1889, the first paper came out in about January of 1889, the first commission. They published the second results, and Lauder Bruton said categorically there were no cardiac effects, and the only effects were due to depressed respiration.
With The Lancet's own representative convinced that chloroform had no effect on the heart, Laurie wrote a scathing attack on the London doctors who warned of chloroform's dangers.
The deaths under anaesthesia in England represent an appalling picture of incapacity of the medical profession as regards the administration of these drugs. We have always said that if students in India can be taught to give chloroform with guaranteed safety, the splendid men we study in the London medical schools with all their advantages can be taught to do the same.
But despite Laurie's assertions about chloroform's safety, people were still dying, and his experiments had their flaws. The famed physiologist Leonard Hill said in response that the doctrine that chloroform kills by paralysing the respiratory centre, propounded by the findings of the two Hyderabad chloroform commissions, and the prejudiced enthusiasm of Surgeon Major Laurie, is one of the most pernicious and dangerous doctrines ever put before the medical profession. But Laurie's bias wasn't the only problem. Leonard Hill found problems with the experiments themselves, which started with the animals in boxes into which chloroform had been introduced. Hill noted that no less than 6% were found to have died unobserved in the boxes during induction, before any experiments on them had been set up. In this, he said, the Commission gives away their whole case. They never observed these accidental deaths. He was right. Laurie had ignored these deaths completely, attributing them to the inexperience of his junior colleagues, and omitting them from the results. What's more, Joseph Clover had written in 1874 that some animals are less liable to cardiac syncope than others. In dogs, for example, unless some pains be taken to give a very strong dose, the respiration always stops first. So doctors wondered exactly how applicable to humans the results were anyway, as Dr. Christine Ball explains.
Well, so what's interesting about all of these commissions is that they were largely experiments on animals. And so various animals have different effects with chloroform. And so they weren't always transferable sort of results. What's interesting about Hyderabad is that it was obviously in India, and at that time they would not have been able to do that work in England because by then they had the Vivisection Act passed. And so whereas in the early days of the Chloroform Committee in the 1860s, people were still able to do all sorts of experiments in their own homes. But by the time we get to Hyderabad, they wouldn't have been able to do that in London. All scientific experiments had to be done in laboratories and they had to be sort of signed off. But they did an extraordinary, like 400 and something animals were anaesthetised, and a lot of them died as a result of the chloroform that was given to them there. It was really, I think what was interesting about it was how uncontrolled and bizarre it was that they just kept giving all these chloroform to these animals and killing them, which seemed a bit unnecessary because it didn't give us any more knowledge.
The Hyderabad Chloroform Commissions weren't perfect. The issues of bias and the translation of experimental research into everyday practice are problems that we still have to tackle in clinical research. And although today the national audit projects have wide reach, that isn't necessarily true for every piece of research published. The chloroform committees and commissions didn't seem to make much difference, and when we read about all of these reports detailing chloroform's dangers, we assume that every doctor was reading them.
What it shows is that, in the big centres, there were big academic centres that had nothing to do with what was going on in the rest of the country. The GP out in the back blocks of the country with his chloroform in his doctor's bag was just going and removing a toenail or, tying off a hemorrhoid or whatever with his chloroform in his bag. And, he hadn't got time to be worrying about all these commissions. And he might do it for years and years and years before anybody died. And so, he wasn't bothered about it, really, I think. And chloroform was the only thing that he could really get to work. Ether was going to be too much trouble on someone's kitchen table. But I don't think it's any different now. And I think that's the trouble with studying history. You look back at these big sentinel events and assume that they change things. But, if you look at anaesthesia now and all the stuff that's coming out in the literature, none of us can read it all. If we work at big academic institutions, then we've got enough people around telling us what's going on, and you hope you go to the odd conference. But really, out there in private practice in remote areas, people will go on doing the same things they've always done. I mean, it's just human nature. You do what you do and you do it well, but you're not going to change your practice every year because somebody comes along with some big report. We have to be very careful looking back at history to assume that books and commissions and all of these things that we see as these sentinel events really were that sentinel. It takes a long time for things to percolate through practice, really. It's no different now, I don't think.
For the 19th century doctors reading the studies, they could pick one that fit their own assumptions to support their decision to carry on using or avoiding chloroform, and the problem of chloroform deaths continued. Even a final committee set up by the British Medical Association in 1891 couldn't resolve the debate.
People were still dying, and the senior medical hierarchy in London just found these results coming out of Hyderabad as to be just too confusing for words. So they set up, as it were, a third commission, or it was the fourth really, set up by BMA, by the British Medical Association, in 1891. And they surveyed as many hospitals as they could find in the United Kingdom as to what their mortality from the use of anaesthetics was, what they used, what they gave, whether people survived. And they had these huge reporting sheets which they sent out across the whole country. And they received hundreds and hundreds of them back. And the results showed categorically that ether was far safer than chloroform. And this was the turning of the tide. Once that had been published, then people really began to accept that chloroform was potentially dangerous, except for those who said, in my hands, chloroform is perfectly safe because I know how to do it and nobody else does it as well as I do. Unbelievable arrogance of some people that I am the perfect person and I always get it right. It's scary, and it was there, and people continued in that mode.
For the doctors who refused to believe that the only risk of chloroform lay in its ability to gradually stop you breathing, there was no convincing them of the risk of sudden cardiac death. Edward Laureate had been proof of that. For others, trying to balance the benefits of chloroform as a quick and effective drug against the potential risks, they'd have to ask themselves why they were giving it, and whether the risk was worth it, given another agent was available. Ether might have been an imperfect anaesthetic, but it was definitely safer. It had taken decades, but the evidence that chloroform could induce cardiac syncope was beginning to stack up, whether people believed it or not. Today we still have to tackle the problems of research in medicine, from conflicting studies to research fraud, and there are issues in healthcare that are debated and redebated as new information comes to light. If the chloroform commissions can teach us anything, it's that in our own research we have to be open-minded about the possibilities and critical of the results, however they support or undermine our own beliefs. The experiences of early anaesthetists with chloroform would shape our modern approach to anaesthetic risk, avoiding it where we can, actively managing it where we can't, and sometimes taking a calculated risk based on the knowledge available to us. After the results of the 1891 Commission were published, chloroform's use would begin to decline, but there were still plenty of people who'd continue to use it, and it wouldn't be until 1911, 20 years later, that conclusive evidence of exactly how chloroform stopped the heart would be presented. That's next time on the final episode of Ether Or. Thanks to Dr. David Wilkinson and Dr. Christine Ball for their expertise, and to Dr. Tim Cook for taking the time to discuss the Royal College of Anaesthetists' 7th National Audit Project. Thanks also to broadcaster and journalist Alan Jenkins for providing a voice for Edward Laureate. You can find more information about the risks of anaesthesia from the website of the Royal College of Anaesthetists, www.rcoa.ac.uk. Our music was composed by Nicola Chang, and this episode was written, recorded and edited by me, Matthew Heron. Please rate, review and subscribe to Ether Or. It helps other people find the show. Thanks for listening.